Well, thanks for coming in to meet with me today, Monica. It's my understanding that you have some questions about our COVID mandatory vaccine policy that we've implemented.
Yeah, Brian, I appreciate you holding the meeting. I do have a number of concerns and questions, and I'm glad that we have the opportunity to discuss it.
Sure. What are those concerns and questions that you're having about our mandatory vaccine policy?
I mean, as you know, there are a lot of issues and a lot of controversies surrounding the COVID vaccine. And I am one of the people who is a little critical of the vaccine. I have a lot of questions and concerns around it. And at this time, I just don't support getting it for myself.
Sure. We understand that a few of our employees are having concerns and issues, getting the vaccine and adhering to that policy, but that is a mandatory policy. Is there any particular reason that you may not want to get the vaccine?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm concerned that it is a mandatory policy. I think that, ultimately we should all have the right to choose what goes into our body. I don't appreciate that the company is requiring me to get it. And then above and beyond that, in my own personal convictions, I also have religious beliefs that support my opposition to getting the vaccine.
Sure. Well, employees under law do have the ability to apply for a religious accommodation or a disability accommodation if those may apply to that employee. Would you like me to ensure that you get the religious accommodation form to fill out?
I mean, I'll look the form over, but ultimately I don't really think that it's your business for me to have to say anything about my religion. I think ultimately I have a sincerely held religious belief, and so I don't think that it's your business, and I don't want to share with the employer what my beliefs are.
Sure, and we understand that religious beliefs are really personal to the individual that holds those beliefs.
Yes.
Just unfortunately under law, in order for us to evaluate whether an accommodation is going to apply to you, we will need to review that information to ensure that you do have beliefs that would be impacted by you getting the vaccine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my assistant sends over to you the religious accommodation form. You look that over and decide if you'd like to fill that out or not. If you would, just go ahead and fill it out and send it over to me. And if you don't, unfortunately, we will have to consider you for either an unpaid leave of absence or to possibly terminate your employment.
Okay, and how quickly would you expect that I have an answer?
Sure. Well, we are trying to have those turned around within 7 days just to allow you enough time to go ahead and get the vaccine in accordance with our policy if we do ultimately end up denying your accommodation.
Okay. I'll look it over.
Welcome back to another episode of Employment Law After Hours. As promised, this episode is going to cover those religious accommodation requests that you've all been requesting in the comments. So before we go through this episode, diving into religious accommodation requests, what they look like, what a conversation with HR may look like, I think it might be best to take the time to introduce the person sitting next to me for all our new viewers. This is my colleague, Monica, who none of you have really seen if you've joined the channel in the last 3 weeks, but we're really excited to have Monica back.
It's really exciting to be back.
Now, before we get into the specifics of what you just saw on your screen and what's to come, including the decision that's ultimately rendered by the company, we do want to the purpose of this video isn't supposed to be legal advice. We're not telling you, how a decision should be rendered on a religious accommodation request or even how HR should necessarily conduct a meeting. We're just showing you those scenes for example purposes. We expect, most of you to be consulting with your employment attorney or other HR advisor on how best to render a decision on religious accommodations. To recap what you just saw, essentially the company that we made up and the HR advisor that I was pretending to be implemented a mandatory vaccine policy for COVID-19. Now, essentially, we rolled out this policy, and Monica, who's playing a fake employee, wanted to address some concerns she had with that policy. So I'm going to turn over to Monica to let her explain what she was requesting and what she was saying.
A lot of the requests that I made in our skit are those that Brian and I see pretty regularly when we review religious accommodation requests. So they're going to be sort of the basis for an employee asking for a religious accommodation from a mandatory vaccination. So their belief system, what they're basing their views on, various scripture verses we've seen, on the basis of certain toxins. I talked about those. So essentially, that was us walking through what an employee might say in a reasonable accommodation interview.
Now, Monica, at one point during that scene, you did have a concern about me asking about your religious beliefs. Would you like to explain that for a moment?
Yeah, so there is nothing by law that prohibits an employer from sort of diving a little further into a religious accommodation request or otherwise requiring an employee to fill out paperwork. Which
was the purpose of me saying, would you like to review the form?
Yeah, but we wanted to make sure that in me challenging Brian's request for the form that the viewers understand that they might be faced with those challenges from employees.
So 2 quick important takeaways to take from that scene. First, just a reminder, the CMS mandatory vaccine policy does take effect in just a few days. So you're going to want to have those policies that we discussed in that opening scene ready to go, especially if you're one of those applicable healthcare providers. If not, this policy does apply to non-healthcare providers as well that have mandatory vaccine policies.
Right.
The second takeaway is, again, as Monica emphasized, if someone is going to request an accommodation, it is best to have a form that you can hand to them to fill out. It helps slow the process down. It helps them get all their thoughts out onto that paper, explaining why they think they need that accommodation. So that's how we ended that scene. Now let's go ahead and jump into the second scene. Thanks for coming in today again, Monica. I really appreciate you taking the time again so we can work through your objections to getting the mandatory vaccine. We did receive your form, so thank you for filling that out. Your form did request a religious accommodation from the COVID vaccine. I do have a couple follow-up questions, though, for you. It's part of the legal requirements that we have when analyzing those requests is to determine, 1, that they're sincerely held, and 2, that they are valid beliefs that would be impacted if you were required to get the vaccine.
I was under the impression that if I filled out the forms and I established that I have a very clearly held religious belief that
Sure.
that was sufficient. I didn't know that I was coming in for an interrogation.
No, this is not intended to be an interrogation, but again, we certainly do understand that this is a process that may not otherwise be enjoyable. The reason that we have these follow-up questions is we do need to make sure that these are personally held beliefs that you have, and we just have a couple follow-up questions for you. I'd like to run through them. If you're uncomfortable answering any of them, that's okay. We can move on from that question, so just go ahead and let me know. First, reviewing your accommodation request, it is clear that you do have these beliefs and you follow, as you indicated, the Word of God. You stated that your body is a temple and that you must protect it from hazardous substances. Are you able to elaborate a little bit as to how you protect your body from hazardous substances?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my letter sort of explains it, but I'm happy to go into it a little further. At the end of the day, I am a firm believer that we get one body. It is God-given, and that it is our job to protect it while we're here on earth. Every day I practice a number of self-care routines. I am up early. I go to the gym. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I take care of myself. I eat clean. I rest. I do everything that sort of the Bible prescribes that we should be doing to ensure that we're following God's word. And I just think ultimately putting a vaccine into my body that, could harm it or have some sort of long-term impact, or that I don't know what's in it, is going to be an objection to God's word.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I understand that may not have been easy for you to do. Are you able to describe for me how long you've held those beliefs?
Yeah, I have been a lifelong Christian and a churchgoer. I'm there every Sunday, and it's something that, I was born and raised into, and I've sort of carried on throughout my adult life.
You had indicated that you believe that there are dangerous substances within the COVID vaccine. Are you able to share which of those substances you believe would be harmful to your body?
There are a number of articles out there that indicate that there are various toxins and bacterias in the COVID vaccine, and there are just substances that I don't trust and I don't believe that our body is made to process.
Well, thank you again, Monica, for taking the time today to speak with me. Those are all the questions I had for now. But what we're going to do now is I'm going to put this under advisement with our COVID accommodation request team, and we'll let you know our response. In the event that we do grant it, we may have some other accommodations that you'll have to follow, such as continued mask wearing and possibly weekly testing. In the event that we deny your request for accommodation, you, again, would then have the option to either get the vaccine or risk being terminated or placed on unpaid leave. So I just want to let you know that those are the options that could be forthcoming, but we'll let you know again within the next couple of days as to what's going to happen.
Okay.
That's obviously some great acting coming from Monica and I there, if I do say so myself. But the purpose of that scene was to show you, okay, here's what happens after HR gets the form back from the employee. They do have that opportunity to review that form and, see if there are any questions that arise. Now, remember, when you're reviewing religious accommodation requests, you're looking to see, are those beliefs both, 1, sincerely held, and 2, are those beliefs impacted if they would be required to abide by that policy, in this case, by getting the COVID vaccine. So in this case, what you saw was I had already received the form back from Monica. She had some issues with the vaccine policy that may impact her religious beliefs, but I also have the opportunity as do HR professionals and employees to sit down and say, here are the questions that I have based on the form that you gave us.
This is not going to be unusual for employers and employees to engage in this kind of conversation throughout the reasonable accommodation process. It's important that employers stay, level-headed and cool-tempered when it comes to having these conversations. As you can see, and Brian and I were truly just, off the riff talking with each other. You can see that I challenged Brian. I ask him questions that he's otherwise not prepared for. And I mean, that's the reality of it. As an employer sitting across from an employee, you have no idea how they're going to approach the conversation, especially when you're questioning, or how they would interpret it to be questioning their religious beliefs. So you've got to kind of prepare for those questions, the concerns, the maybe, backlash that could come from having these conversations, which was essentially, what I did to Brian.
Yeah, and as Monica said, there were some difficult questions to ask, but I think it's important that employers always remain empathetic to the employees in these cases. This is both a difficult decision for them as it is for you, and their feelings and their emotions are as valid as the beliefs and the ideals of the company that's implementing this policy. So it's important that everyone stay level-headed, as Monica said. Try to get through this process. Again, you're just trying to affirm, were these beliefs sincerely held, and two, are they impacted by that policy. Now, the EEOC does typically state that you should assume that one's religious beliefs are valid off the bat. We tend to subscribe to that as well in our practice. There are some new recent cases as well that have come out that may allow an employer to make a finding that those beliefs are not sincerely held without going through this interview process. So although this interview process is not required, it is definitely an important tool that HR and employers utilize in helping you make the best decision.
There are a couple of, accommodation requests that we've looked at where we don't ultimately say that an employee does not have sincerely held beliefs, but it may just be that they haven't explained them well enough, or they haven't asserted them in such a way as to meet that threshold. And so that's sort of what the reasonable accommodation process allows for.
And it's also important to remember that for employers, beliefs can change over time. An employee can have a set of beliefs 5 years ago, and then those beliefs have now changed. And, it may just be they've done some deeper digging in the last 2 years because of COVID, but you shouldn't just right off the bat assume that, hey, just because they have these new beliefs, that they are invalid beliefs. So don't be going down with that assertion. You want to have that objective evidence if you are ultimately going to render a decision to deny a reasonable accommodation on the basis that those beliefs are not sincerely held.
Yeah, similarly, there's a lot of guidance out there to indicate that just because an employee may not have previously refused a vaccination, or because they'd previously received a vaccination, that they somehow should be swayed one way or another based on the COVID vaccine, and that's not the case either.
As the key takeaway here, I think it's important that if this conversation is going to occur between HR and the employee, that you do end the conversation by, saying, hey, we will continue to review your request and then ultimately make a decision. Don't be making a decision right there on the spot, because now obviously the conversation is very tense, it's heightened. You don't want to be making that decision on the spot. Take what they said, evaluate what that employee said, and then go back and review and analyze it before ultimately making that decision. All right, so let's see what decision I actually came to based on Monica's request. Thank you again, Monica, for meeting with me today. The company has come to a decision regarding your religious accommodation request. At this time, we did find that your beliefs to be sincerely held, and that those beliefs, as you had stated, would be impacted if you were forced to get the vaccine. Therefore, at this time, the company is willing to offer you a religious accommodation, so you will not at this time have to get the vaccine. However, you will be required to always wear a mask unless you're eating or drinking. You will also be required to conduct weekly COVID testing, which will be at your cost. And then in addition, when possible, you need to maintain social distancing from your coworkers at 6 feet or greater.
Will the company be providing me the face masks and the PPE that I need?
At this time, because of the state that we are located in, we are not required to provide those to you at our cost. Therefore, you will be required to supply your own face masks and as I said, the testing that you'll need to conduct.
What happens if I can't find a rapid test?
So, as you may know, the President Biden has made available 4 rapid tests available to you for free. So you can go online, sign up. Those will be mailed to your house. In addition, we are working with a couple suppliers to possibly source and purchase testing, and then we would pass those on to you at our cost.
Okay, that sounds great. In the alternative, is there any way that I can just work from home instead?
That's a great question. So at this time, we are not allowing employees to just work from home as the accommodation. Obviously, that remains subject to change in the future, but because that vaccine is available to you and a lot of your job duties do require you to be at work to adequately conduct those duties, we are going to require that you come to the office every day as you have been thus far.
Okay.
Well, thank you again for coming in, and let us know if you have any other questions.
Thanks, Brian.
All right, before we get into analyzing what you just saw and the decision that the company made, I do want to say we do have an alternate ending coming your way with some more information, so stay tuned for that after this quick analysis. But I just kind of want to jump right in here. Obviously, the company granted her religious accommodation request, but it's not that simple. So you granted this accommodation request, they no longer have to get the vaccine, but you are still required by OSHA and CMS and your state and local laws to protect your workforce. Although OSHA ETS no longer applies, OSHA still has their general duty provisions to protect your workforce. That's the reason why this company ultimately decided, hey, you're going to have to continue to mask, social distance, and because the hypothetical state that we were in allowed it, we were going to require you to get tested weekly and pay for that testing. So those were the accommodations that were put in place. Obviously, Monica pushed for some others that we'll go ahead and let her explain.
Yeah, so it's probably not going to be uncommon, and it probably hasn't been uncommon for a lot of employers to be faced with questions about telework and a part-time schedule. Can I be in the office sometimes, at home sometimes? Ultimately, those are going to be business decisions. Ultimately, we suggest, or we believe is in best practice to, like I said earlier, evaluate each request on a case-by-case basis. But otherwise, you're not required to allow an employee to telework in lieu of getting a vaccine or otherwise abiding by mandatory masking, social distancing, and whatnot.
So I think the important takeaway from this scene was if you're going to grant those accommodations, remember that you still need to, put those accommodations in place, which are the masking and the testing, or whatever you choose to do from a business decision or legal standpoint. So definitely get with your trusted advisor to figure out what you're allowed to do under state law, who can pay for the PPE, who can pay for the testing under state law, while you're making those decisions. And best to have those conversations before you need to have a conversation with the employee. So as promised, let's jump into that alternate ending. Thank you again, Monica, for meeting with me today. The purpose of this meeting is to inform you that the company has decided to deny your request for religious accommodation.
Why are you saying that I don't have religious beliefs? Or
That's a great question. The company has actually determined that your religious beliefs are sincerely held and that they may be impacted if you were to get the vaccine.
That is absolutely the case.
However, the company under law does reserve the right to deny religious accommodation requests if they would cause an undue hardship on the company. We believe that the risk that you have of possibly infecting other employees would create an undue hardship on the company.
What about the undue hardship on me?
We certainly understand that hardship as well that would be imposed upon you. For that reason, if you decide not to get the vaccine you will still have the opportunity to get the vaccine if you'd like, but if you decide not to, we will not fight your unemployment with the state, so you can continue to get unemployment benefits. We will also be offering you 2 weeks of severance payment to go out and use those 2 weeks to go out and find a new job.
You had mentioned that the concern is that I'm going to spread to other employees. But I feel like that fails to acknowledge that even vaccinated people can spread. Can you explain that?
It's in addition to not only can you spread it to other employees, but there is obviously a likelihood as established by the CDC and the science that if you were to contract COVID as an unvaccinated employee, the harm and risk to you would actually be greater than it would be for a vaccinated employee.
Okay, well, I'm not happy about this at all. And in fact, you're going to be hearing from my lawyer because there's no way that the company's actions aren't violating my religious beliefs.
Again, we certainly understand your concerns in this matter, and obviously, you speak with whoever you need to speak with. Just let us know again if you would like to entertain receiving the 2 weeks of severance payments that we have offered to you, or if your decision to get the vaccine is otherwise changed.
Okay.
So let's describe what you just saw. This alternate ending essentially stated, hey, we did find that your beliefs were sincere, but because of the undue hardship exception to religious accommodations under that de minimis easy to meet standard, the company ultimately decided to deny the accommodation request. Although we decided that those religious beliefs were sincere, an employer doesn't necessarily need to decide those beliefs were sincere. The EEOC does state that if you have objective evidence to find that religious beliefs are not sincere, you can make that finding and then still deny the accommodation. But in this case, the company did want to state, hey, the beliefs may or may not be sincere. We'll assume that they are, but we're still going to deny under the de minimis undue hardship exception. In that case, then, as you know, we'll let Monica explain a little bit more. We did, ultimately let her go as a company, offering her some severance and unemployment. If you're going to deny based on not sincerely held, you better have some objective evidence to back up that decision. And in this case, you don't necessarily want to get into a debate with that person once the decision's been made. The company has made its decision, own up to it, move forward. Now, along those same lines as to what was being offered, we did choose as a fake company to offer not to challenge our unemployment filing. That is a business decision that the company made. It was not one that was required by law, and it's not one that you may be able to make in your state. Employees generally have the ability to file for unemployment whenever they're separated. It's up to the employer to challenge that filing.
Yeah, so just to bounce off of what Brian said, the company that we were working with in our skit also offered me as the employee a 2-week payment and severance to be, terminated from the position. And generally that comes with a release of claims confidentiality, whatnot. That also, much like the unemployment benefits, and the challenge of them is a business decision. So there's nothing that requires an employer to enter into a separation or severance agreement.
So we really appreciate you staying tuned to this lengthy episode today. There's a lot of information that was unpacked in here. So, feel free to, definitely reach out to your legal advisor with the questions that you may have regarding what you saw today. But we really appreciate you staying tuned. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, as we do have more information that we'll be rolling out over the next couple of weeks as these policies and these COVID issues continue to unravel. We'll see you next time.
See ya.